Colonel Lennox, we need you now.
The man who said it wore full tactical gear and a rank insignia that had no business being inside a county emergency room. Behind him, 2 armed operators blocked the exit. Outside, a black Blackhawk sat in the physician parking lot, rotors still cutting through the rain. Every nurse, every doctor stood frozen, all of them staring at the same woman. The quiet one. The one who changed bedpans and never complained and never talked about where she came from. She didn't look surprised by any of it. She only looked tired, the way someone looks when they always knew this moment would find them. If you want to know what she was hiding, and why the most dangerous person in that building had been mopping floors for 3 weeks, stick around. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Oak Creek Memorial was the kind of hospital that people in the Pacific Northwest ended up at when they had no other choice. Tucked into a narrow valley 3 hours from Seattle, it handled logging accidents, bar fights, and the occasional overdose. A Level 3 trauma center that ran on institutional coffee and the quiet desperation of a staff that had been short-handed for years. The fluorescent lights in the main corridor flickered every time the heating system kicked on. The break room refrigerator made a sound like a dying engine. Nobody had filed a maintenance request in so long that the form itself had gone missing. The hospital ran on hierarchy, the way most small institutions do, not on merit but on tenure. Those who had been there longest spoke the loudest, and those who were newest learned quickly to keep their heads down. Avery Lennox had been a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial for exactly 3 weeks, and in that time she had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wore scrubs a size too large. She kept her ash-brown hair twisted into a tight bun at the base of her neck. She took every overnight shift that nobody else wanted, showed up early, left late, and never once mentioned where she had worked before or why she had chosen a place like this to start over. The head of nursing, Marlene Keating, had been running the emergency department for over 20 years with the energy of someone who treated competence as a personal insult to her authority. She assigned Avery the worst of everything, stripping and remaking beds, mopping up after trauma cases, managing the drunk and combative patients who came in on Friday nights, entering billing codes at 2 in the morning. Marlene had decided in the first week that Avery was unremarkable, and once Marlene made up her mind about a person, no evidence to the contrary could reach her. Dr. Graham Vance, the department's senior emergency physician, had a different set of problems. He was loud where Avery was quiet, certain where she was careful, and he wore his credentials like a man who needed everyone in the room to know exactly how many years he had spent earning them. 3 nights before the pileup, a patient had come in with a cardiac arrhythmia, and Graham had called the wrong medication, not dangerously wrong, but wrong enough that the patient's condition deteriorated faster than it should have. Avery had been standing at the medication cart. Without drawing attention to herself, she had placed the correct drug into the hand of the charge nurse and said quietly that the doctor might want to reconsider the defibrillation setting. The patient survived. Graham accepted the praise from the attending cardiologist without ever acknowledging that the correction had come from the woman changing bed sheets in the hallway. Tessa Munro, 24 years old and 6 months out of nursing school, had watched the whole thing happen. She was the only person on staff who seemed to notice that something about Avery didn't add up, not in a threatening way, more the way you notice that a piece of furniture in a room is slightly off-center. Everything was technically in the right place, but the proportions were wrong. Tessa hadn't said anything about it. She kept watching. The night of the accident started like any other, badly and without warning. The call came in just after 11. A 10-vehicle chain collision on the interstate triggered by black ice and a jackknifed lumber truck had sent 9 people to Oak Creek and 3 more to the regional center 40 miles east. The emergency bay filled up in under 20 minutes. Graham was managing 2 cases simultaneously, barking orders at anyone within earshot. Marlene moved through the controlled chaos with the efficiency of long-habit triaging, delegating, keeping the department from tipping into full disorder. Avery was doing what she always did, staying at the edges, handling what needed handling, making herself useful without making herself visible. The young man came in on the 3rd ambulance. He was in his early 20s, broad-shouldered, still wearing the remnants of a flannel work shirt that the paramedics had cut open. His blood pressure was dropping fast, his heart rate climbing in compensation, and the left side of his chest was dark with bruising from clavicle to lower rib. He was barely responsive. The paramedic rattled off the vitals during handoff, and Graham moved in immediately, calling for an ultrasound and ordering fluid resuscitation, already building his diagnosis around internal abdominal bleeding. Avery stood just outside the trauma bay doorway. She wasn't supposed to be managing this case. Marlene had her assigned to intake paperwork, but something made her stop. She looked at the patient the way a person looks at something when they're trying to read it, rather than react to it. She watched the respiratory tech squeeze the bag valve mask. She watched the left side of the patient's chest. It didn't rise, not even slightly. While the right side expanded with each compression, the left remained flat and locked as though something inside it had seized. She looked at his neck. The veins along the jugular were distended, raised, and visible in a way that had nothing to do with fluid volume. She looked at the slight but unmistakable deviation of his trachea toward the right. Everything she was seeing pointed to the same conclusion, and none of it matched the diagnosis Graham was building at the monitor. The patient had a tension pneumothorax. Air was trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung and pushing the heart sideways. The ultrasound Graham was waiting for would tell him nothing useful. The fluids would do nothing. In less than 60 seconds, the pressure would stop the heart entirely. Avery walked into the trauma bay. She didn't ask permission. She moved to the supply cart, picked up a large bore needle, and reached across to take Graham's wrist in a grip that was firm enough to stop him mid-motion. He turned to her with the expression of a man who was about to say something cutting, and she spoke before he could get a word out. Her voice had changed. It was the same voice, technically same pitch, same accent, but every trace of deference had left it. She told him where the needle needed to go and why, and she told him to do it immediately. The words weren't a suggestion. The room went very still. Graham stared at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then something in the specificity of what she had said. The anatomical landmarks, the clinical certainty, the absence of hesitation cut through his resistance. He took the needle. He followed her instruction. When the tip entered the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, a rush of pressurized air hissed out with enough force to be audible across the room. The patient's blood pressure began climbing on the monitor. His heart rate steadied. Color moved back into his face. Avery stepped back. The shift in her was immediate and complete, shoulders dropping, chin lowering, hands folding together in front of her. She said quietly that she had read about needle decompression in a textbook and thought it might apply. She apologized for interrupting. She left the room before anyone could respond. Tessa watched her go. She had been standing against the far wall for the entire sequence, and she had seen all of it. The way Avery had read the patient's body from the doorway, the way she had moved to the cart, without any uncertainty, the way she had held Graham's wrist. People who learned things from textbooks moved differently. They second-guessed themselves. They looked for confirmation. Avery had done none of those things. She had moved like someone who had performed that exact procedure in conditions far worse than a hospital trauma bay. and the memory of it lived in her hands and her eyes rather than in anything she could have read. Tessa stored that observation somewhere quiet and said nothing to anyone. The ground started shaking at 4:47 in the morning, when the department had finally slowed to a manageable pace and half the staff was running on nothing but exhaustion. The vibration came up through the floor tiles. Before the sound arrived, a low physical frequency that rattled the medication carts and sent a stack of charts sliding off the nurse's station. Then the sound caught up a deep rhythmic percussion that grew from distant to overwhelming in the span of about 15 seconds. The fluorescent lights shuddered. Someone's coffee mug walked to the edge of the counter and fell. Through the rain-streaked windows facing the parking lot, a shape descended from the dark sky, massive, black, and completely indifferent to the clearly marked helipad on the roof of the building. The Black Hawk hit the physician parking lot hard enough to crack the asphalt. The rotors kept turning. 3 men came through the front entrance before the rotor wash had even settled. They wore tactical gear plate carriers, communication earpieces, side arms holstered at the thigh, and they moved through the emergency department. The way people move through spaces they have already assessed from the outside. Graham stepped forward instinctively, assuming they were escorting a high-value patient, and began introducing himself. The man in front, tall, weathered face, early 40s, looked through him as though he were a piece of furniture. Marlene moved to intercept them at the corridor junction, planting herself squarely in their path, and informing them in the tone she reserved for people she intended to remove from her department, that this was a medical facility with protocols, and that whatever they needed would have to wait for proper authorization. The man reached into his chest pocket and held open a credential wallet. Marlene read what was inside it. She stepped aside without another word. Major Declan Rourke of the Joint Special Operations Command scanned the room. His gaze moved across the nursing staff, the intake desk, the trauma bay, the supply corridor, and then it stopped. In the far corner, standing beside the nurse's station, with a stack of intake forms in her hands, was a woman in oversized scrubs, with her hair pulled back and her eyes already fixed on him. She hadn't flinched when the helicopter landed. She hadn't crowded toward the windows with everyone else. She was just watching him, and in her expression there was no confusion, only the flat, heavy look of someone who had been waiting for a door to open and was not glad to see it. Declan crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He came to attention and delivered a salute that was precise, formal, and completely out of place in a county emergency room at 5 in the morning. "Colonel Lennox," he said, "we need you now." The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room permanently. Graham had turned around. Marlene was staring. Tessa, standing near the trauma bay entrance, felt the pieces she had been quietly collecting over 3 weeks suddenly lock into place with a weight she hadn't expected. Declan laid out the situation in the compressed, direct language of someone delivering a mission brief rather than an explanation. A synthetic pathogen had been detected in the ventilation system of a 50-story building in downtown Seattle. The dispersal was active. Casualties would begin within the hour if nothing changed, and the casualty count would not stop at the building. The person responsible was known. The only individual with both the biological expertise and the operational background to go in and stop it was standing in front of him, holding a stack of insurance forms. He set a hard-sided military case on the nurse's station counter and opened it. Inside, a secured communications device, a sidearm, and a clearance badge with a classification level that Marlene would not have been able to read even if she had been standing close enough to try. Avery set the forms down. She looked at the case. She looked at Declan. Whatever internal calculation she was running, it didn't take long. She reached up and unzipped the front of her oversized scrubs top, shrugging it off to reveal the fitted, dark base layer underneath and below, that visible now at her waistband, the edge of a tactical holster she had been wearing every single day for 3 weeks. She picked up the clearance badge and clipped it to her collar. Then she turned to Graham. Her voice had that quality again, the one that had no deference in it, no apology, nothing soft at the edges. She told him that the next time he saw a patient with a deviated trachea, distended neck veins, and unilateral chest movement, he should put a needle in before he called for the ultrasound. The delay, she said, would kill them. It almost killed the man tonight. Graham said nothing. There was nothing to say. Avery picked up the case, walked through the front doors, and stepped into the rain. The Black Hawk's rotors were already accelerating. She climbed in without looking back at the building, at the people watching through the glass, or at the quiet, unremarkable life she had been carefully constructing for 3 weeks in a place where no one knew her name. The Black Hawk climbed hard into the rain and banked west before the lights of Oak Creek had fully disappeared below them. Inside the cabin, the noise was enough to make conversation difficult, which suited Avery fine. She sat across from Declan, with the hard case open across her knees, and worked through its contents, methodically checking the sidearms chamber, testing the earpiece, reading the single-page intelligence summary that had been printed on paper designed to dissolve in water. Declan watched her do all of this and said nothing. He had worked with people who needed time to adjust to the transition from civilian life back to operational reality. Avery didn't appear to need any. When she finished, she looked up and told him to start from the beginning. Declan laid it out. Automated biosurveillance sensors embedded in Seattle's downtown air monitoring network had flagged a synthetic pathogen just after 3 in the morning, an engineered hybrid hemorrhagic fever combined with a respiratory transmission mechanism that made standard influenza look sluggish by comparison. People exposed to a sufficient concentration would begin showing symptoms within 20 minutes. The mortality rate in early modeling was sitting at 90%. The source had been traced to the ventilation infrastructure of Solstice Tower, a 50-story building in the financial district that housed beneath its corporate exterior. A secured Department of Defense data repository for classified biological research. The building had gone into automatic lockdown. A SWAT team of 12 had been sent in through the lower mechanical floors to seize control of the ventilation system. All 12 had gone silent within 40 minutes of entry, some lost in the lower duct network. Others confirmed down on the intermediate technical floors, none of them having reached the 48th floor control room. Avery listened to this without expression. Then she asked about the inhibitor. Declan reached into his vest and produced a sealed transport cylinder, palm-sized, containing a single vial of blue-tinted liquid. He explained that the compound had been synthesized specifically to neutralize the pathogen's molecular structure, developed under classified conditions by a DoD research team that had spent 72 hours doing nothing else. There was no second vial. The synthesis process couldn't be compressed further. If this one failed or was lost, there would be no time to produce another before the secondary dispersal system activated and the pathogen moved beyond the building's sealed air envelope and into the open atmosphere above the city. Avery turned the cylinder in her hands. 4 million people in Seattle. The wind off the Sound running southwest at this hour. She didn't say any of that out loud. She already knew Declan had run those numbers. Then he told her who had built it. The name landed in her chest like something physical. Dr. Conrad Hale, her former commanding officer and the man who had taught her everything she knew about biological containment, threat, assessment, and the specific kind of thinking required to engineer a crisis that the government's own response protocols couldn't solve. 5 years ago, she had sat in a closed military tribunal and delivered testimony that ended his career and his freedom. He had been held at a maximum security facility ever since until 72 hours ago, when someone with high-level access credentials had walked him out. The internal investigation into who had helped him was still ongoing, which meant the person responsible might still have access to operational communications, which was why Avery was going in alone. Conrad knew exactly how an assault team would move. He had written parts of the protocol himself. A large force would walk into whatever he had prepared. One person moving without the standard footprint was the only angle he might not have fully anticipated. The mission condition was simple and final. Avery would be dropped onto the roof of Solstice Tower, enter through the ventilation access point on the mechanical level, navigate to the air handling control room on the 48th floor, and introduce the inhibitor into the central filtration intake. If she succeeded, the pathogen would be neutralized throughout the building's sealed system before it could reach the secondary dispersal threshold. If she did not succeed within the allotted window, the Air Force would destroy the building with a tactical strike to prevent any atmospheric release. Everyone inside, including Avery, would be considered an acceptable loss. Declan said that last part, the way military people say things they don't want to say but won't soften. Avery acknowledged it with a single nod. She had heard similar language before. She had even used it herself once in a different room about different people. That memory was one of several reasons she had left. She strapped on the plate carrier from the case, secured the inhibitor cylinder in the interior chest pocket, checked the earpiece connection to Declan's frequency, and pulled on the filtration mask. By the time Seattle came into view through the cabin window, she was ready. The city below looked wrong. The streets of the financial district were empty in a way that downtown Seattle never was. No headlights, no pedestrians, the staggered glow of the building towers, reflecting off wet pavement, with no one to cast a shadow. The evacuation cordon was holding. Emergency sirens carried upward through the rain in long, oscillating waves. Solstice Tower rose from the center of the district, 50 floors of glass and steel, with every interior light still burning, as though it were a perfectly normal Wednesday at 5 in the morning. Avery clipped the descent line to her harness, moved to the open cabin door, and dropped. The rooftop was wet and cold and slightly tilted from the slope of the drainage channels. She unclipped from the line before the Black Hawk had fully repositioned and moved immediately to the mechanical housing that contained the primary ventilation access point. The electronic lock took her 40 seconds to bypass using the override tool from the case. The hatch opened into darkness. She activated the small light mounted to the side of her mask and went in. The ductwork inside Solstice Tower had been designed for a building that needed to move enormous volumes of conditioned air across 50 floors. The main channels were large enough to move through on hands and knees without difficulty, but the branching network of secondary ducts that fed individual floors created a maze that would have been disorienting, even with a full diagram. Avery had a partial schematic on the wrist-mounted display, partial, because Conrad had clearly modified the original layout. 2 junctions on her planned route had been physically reconfigured. The display showed a path that no longer existed. She stopped at the first junction and studied the branching options. 3 directions. The original schematic showed the left channel as the correct route to the 48th floor control room. But the left channel had been sealed. She could see fresh metalwork at the junction, recently welded, still showing heat discoloration. Conrad had blocked the obvious path. She moved the light down the center channel and found what she had been afraid of finding, about 30 feet in 2 sets of boot soles, up belonging to members of the SWAT team, who had come in through the lower floors and made it further than their colleagues before the pathogen reached them. She took the right channel. It was slower. She had to backtrack twice when secondary branches dead-ended at sealed service hatches, and once she had to hold completely still for nearly a minute, while a vibration moved through the ductwork, some automated system cycling. She decided not a person. The darkness inside the building was different from the darkness outside. Outside, there was weather distance open space. In here, the walls were 8 inches from her shoulders, and the only sound was the hum of systems that someone else controlled. Conrad had taught her that the best defensive architecture exploits the attacker's assumptions. You build the obvious route first, make it clean and accessible, and then you ruin it. The attacker's instinct is to adapt to the next most obvious option, so you ruin that one too. The attacker who survives is the one who stops thinking about what seems most logical and starts thinking about what the defender least wants them to find. Avery had spent a long time trying to forget the things Conrad had taught her. In a ventilation shaft 40 stories above Seattle, she was grateful she hadn't managed it. She reached the access panel above the 48th floor control room 17 minutes after entering the ductwork. Through the steel mesh, she could see the room below. 4 members of the SWAT team were on the floor, the ones who had made it furthest closest to the objective before the pathogen overtook them. Their gear was intact weapons, armor, communications equipment, all of it undamaged. The pathogen had done what bullets couldn't. They hadn't had time to fire a single shot. Conrad stood at the central control console, with his back partially turned, working through a sequence on the primary terminal. He wore a full positive pressure protective suit sealed at every joint. The countdown on the main display showed the secondary dispersal sequence reaching its final stage. The numbers were moving. Avery eased the mesh panel back from its frame and lowered herself through the opening. She had calculated the drop, identified the landing point. Confirmed, there was nothing between her feet and the floor. What she had not seen, because it had been designed not to be seen, was the near-invisible tripwire Conrad had run at shin height directly below the access point. Her right boot caught it on the way down. The alarm was immediate and loud. Before she had fully absorbed the landing, the ceiling-mounted auto turrets dropped from their housings and opened fire. She dove behind the server rack in the same motion that her brain registered what was happening, and the rounds tore through the space she had occupied a half-second before. Then the firing stopped. Conrad had cut the system manually. She could hear him, his voice coming through the sealed helmet of his suit even, and unhurried the way it had always been when he was explaining something he believed completely. "I wondered if they'd send you," he said. "It makes sense. There's no one else who could have made it this far." Avery stayed behind the server rack, weapon up, working the geometry of the room from memory. 2 turrets down on the right side, still active. Console at the far end. Conrad's position center left near the primary terminal. His voice continued almost conversational. He said she must find it remarkable being deployed like this, sent in alone, told the building would be destroyed around her if she failed, handed a single vial and pointed at the problem. He said the system she had served for 15 years had always operated this way. It handed people like her the impossible tasks and called it honor. He said the only difference between what he had built and what they had asked her to carry out tonight was that he was honest about what it cost. Avery came out from behind the server rack and put 2 rounds through the optical sensors of the remaining active turrets. Both went dark. She raised the weapon and trained it on Conrad. She told him to stop talking and open the system. Conrad turned to face her. Even through the protective suit, she could read his posture, not afraid, not urgent, satisfied in the way of someone watching a proof complete itself. He told her the system was biometrically locked to his own physiology. Without his left-hand scan, the central intake valve would not open, and the inhibitor cylinder in her chest pocket would remain exactly as useful as a piece of glass. She crossed the room in 4 steps and shot the weapon from his hand. The round went through his right palm. She had aimed deliberately, leaving the left intact. He went into the console hard. She had him controlled before the pain had fully registered on his face. One arm pinned his body against the terminal. The countdown on the display was under 60 seconds. Conrad looked at the numbers and then looked at her, and he said the thing that found the seam in everything she had built over the past 5 years. He said he remembered the day she testified against him. He said she had walked into that tribunal and told them he had crossed a line that couldn't be justified. And he wanted to know now tonight, with a government-sanctioned strike aircraft orbiting overhead, ready to level the building she was standing in, what exactly she believed that line was, and which side of it she thought they were both standing on. The room was loud, with the sound of systems running, and the distant wail of evacuation sirens below. The countdown moved. Avery looked at him and she felt the question land the way he had intended it, not as an attack, but as a mirror. It was the same question she had been carrying since the day she left the service. She had just never heard it said that plainly by anyone other than herself alone at 3 in the morning, in a rented room in a valley town where no one knew her name. She told him the difference was simple. She didn't kill people to prove it. Then she took his left wrist and pressed his hand flat against the biometric reader. The biometric reader processed Conrad's left handprint for exactly 3 seconds before the screen shifted from red to blue. The accessed confirmation tone was a single, clean note, almost gentle, completely wrong for the moment. Conrad tried to pull his arm back the instant he heard it. Avery held him against the console long enough to register the unlock, then drove him sideways with enough force to put him into the server rack. He hit the floor hard and stayed there, cradling his wounded right hand against his chest, breathing in the controlled way of someone managing serious pain. The countdown was at 31 seconds. Avery moved to the central console. The valve interface had surfaced on the primary screen following the biometric unlock, a manual override panel that required the inhibitor to be physically introduced into the filtration intake port before the automated dispersal sequence reached 0. She had studied the building schematics on the flight in. She knew where the port was. What she had not fully accounted for was the protective casing Conrad had added over it, a secondary housing of reinforced glass, bolted at all 4 corners, designed to prevent exactly what she was about to do. She drew the weapon and put the butt of the grip through the glass in 2 strikes. The casing fractured on the first and shattered on the second, sending fragments across the console surface. She pulled the inhibitor cylinder from her chest pocket, cracked the seal on the transport cap, and exposed the vial of blue liquid beneath. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about the kind of training she had. It didn't make the fear go away. It just moved the fear somewhere that didn't interfere with the hands. The intake port accepted the vial at 22 seconds remaining. She triggered the manual override. The building's ventilation system responded immediately. She could feel it through the floor, a deep mechanical shift as the intake pressure changed and the inhibitor compound began moving through the filtration network. The central display showed distribution pathways, lighting up floor by floor, the blue indicator traveling outward through the building's arterial structure like something being exhaled. The pathogen concentration readings at the top of the screen began to drop. Slowly at first, then faster, as the compound reached the upper distribution nodes. The countdown reached 0. Nothing exploded. No alarm. The dispersal sequence simply ended its trigger condition, no longer viable. The mechanism it had been designed to activate finding nothing left to work with. The concentration readings continued falling. At the 30-second mark after the override, every atmospheric sensor in the building was reading below detectable threshold. The virus was gone. Declan's voice came through the earpiece, and for the first time since she had climbed into the Black Hawk, it carried something other than operational precision. Avery. He said her name without rank, without title, without the mission framing that had surrounded every word he'd spoken for the past 2 hours. Atmospheric sensors outside the building are clean. Strike order has been rescinded. A beat of static. You did it. She set both hands flat on the console and looked at the screen until the numbers stopped meaning anything urgent and became just numbers. Below her 48 floors down, Seattle was still sealed behind its evacuation perimeter, its streets empty, its sirens still running. 4 million people who had no idea how close the morning had come to being something else entirely. Conrad had managed to get himself upright against the server rack. He was watching her with his left hand pressed flat against his thigh and his right arm drawn close, the wound dark through the material of his protective suit. His expression hadn't changed much. There was no collapse, no shock, no visible reckoning. He looked like a man reviewing data that had come in contrary to his hypothesis, disappointed but not surprised by the method of his failure. He said she should understand that stopping him tonight didn't change the fundamental argument. The infrastructure he had exploited was still there. The classified research, the unsupervised programs, the people making decisions about acceptable losses in rooms that didn't appear on any official record. None of that had been dismantled by a single vial of blue liquid pushed through a filtration port. He said she had bought the city a night. That was all. Avery looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that a night was enough. Some people would get to see the morning who otherwise wouldn't have. That was the whole point. That was the only point. He had never understood that. And that was the reason he was sitting on the floor of a building he had intended to use as a weapon, and she was standing at the console that had stopped him. She picked up the empty cylinder, sealed it, and put it back in her chest pocket. The tactical team arrived 6 minutes later, entering through the stairwell access in full biological containment gear. They secured Conrad with practiced efficiency, applied a field dressing to his right hand, and guided him toward the exit without ceremony. A second team moved through the room, checking the 4 SWAT members on the floor, all alive, all presenting early-stage symptoms, all stable enough for immediate medical evacuation. The decontamination crews would follow. The building would be under environmental control for the next 72 hours, while the inhibitor's neutralization of every remaining trace of the pathogen was confirmed by independent testing. Avery sat on the edge of the console and let all of it happen around her. Declan came up the stairwell himself rather than waiting at the command post. He found her there, still in the filtration mask plate carrier, dusty from the ductwork, a constellation of glass fragments from the broken casing still caught in the fabric of her sleeve. He stood across from her and said that the president had asked to speak with her personally. There was a formal commendation being prepared, and there was a position, a real one senior level at the Pentagon, working directly on the biological threat assessment program that had been attempting to track Conrad's network for the past 3 years. Her actual rank reinstated, her actual record unsealed. Everything she had walked away from offered back. Avery pulled the filtration mask down around her neck. She looked at Declan, and she looked at the room, the broken glass, the bodies that had been carried out the console with its readings now steady and green, and then she looked at the window on the far wall. Through it, the sky over Seattle was beginning to separate from black into a dark, deep blue. Not quite dawn, the direction of dawn. She told Declan she appreciated it. She told him the offer was real and the people making it were probably sincere. And then she told him she had a shift at Oak Creek Memorial, and that if she didn't show up, Marlene Keating was going to document 3 consecutive absences in her personnel file, and that was going to create an administrative problem she genuinely did not want to deal with. Declan looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something that is both completely absurd and, on reflection, makes more sense than anything else they could have said. He told her the helicopter was on the roof. She told him she knew where the roof was. She had come in that way. She was back at Oak Creek Memorial by Thursday morning. The drive from the regional airfield where Declan had dropped her took 40 minutes, most of it through the kind of gray, early morning mountain quiet that made it difficult to believe the world contained anything as urgent as what she had spent the night inside of. She changed in the car tactical gear into a fresh set of scrubs she had kept in a bag in the trunk, the plate carrier folded into the hard case, the clearance badge back in the military case that Declan had taken with him. By the time she pushed through the front doors of the emergency department, she looked the way she always looked. Hair in a tight bun, scrubs slightly too large, expression of someone who had been awake too long and had no particular feelings about it. Marlene was at the nurse's station. She looked up from the scheduling board with the particular expression she reserved for people who had caused her administrative inconvenience, and she told Avery that 3 unscheduled absences with no advance notification was a serious breach of department protocol, and that she expected a written explanation by end of shift. She said it without raising her voice, which was how Avery had learned that Marlene's most sincere displeasure was always delivered at a conversational volume. Avery said she was sorry. She said there had been a family situation. Marlene did not ask what kind. She handed Avery the morning assignment sheet and told her that room 4 needed its linens changed and that the patient in Bay 7 required a blood draw that had apparently been overlooked during the overnight. She said it with the tone of someone reasserting an order that had never been in question. Then she turned back to her scheduling board. Avery took the assignment sheet. Graham was in the corridor near the medication room when she came through with the linen cart. He had clearly been at the hospital through the night, the kind of tired that sits around the eyes and in the set of the shoulders, the coffee cup in his hand, the 3rd or 4th of the shift. He saw her coming and found something on his clipboard that required his full attention until she had passed. She didn't stop. There was nothing that needed to be said between them that hadn't already been said in the trauma bay at 4 in the morning, and both of them understood that. The hallway was long and quiet at this hour, the overnight patients in that shallow sleep that precedes a hospital breakfast, the day staff just beginning to filter in. Avery pushed the linen cart at an even pace, her mind doing the thing it had always done after a mission, cataloging, settling, filing things into the places where they could be carried without too much friction. Conrad in custody. The building contained. The city still there on the other side of the mountain, waking up to a Thursday it would never know had almost been its last. Tessa was standing at the junction where the main corridor met the east wing, a tablet in her hand, looking at something on the screen. She looked up when she heard the cartwheels. For a moment she just looked at Avery, and Avery looked back at her the same way they had looked at each other across the trauma bay the night Tessa had watched her work, and understood that what she was seeing didn't have a simple explanation. There was a whole conversation in that look, everything Tessa had seen and correctly understood and chosen not to ask about everything. Avery was never going to explain and didn't need to. Tessa gave a small, deliberate nod. Avery returned it with the same economy. Then she pushed the cart past and kept going. Marlene was still at the nurse's station when Avery came back through with the used linens. Somewhere in the building, the heating system kicked on, and the corridor lights did their familiar flicker. The refrigerator in the break room was making its engine-dying sound. A phone rang at the intake desk, and someone answered it in the board-efficient shorthand of a person who had answered that phone 2,000 times before. Avery fed the linens into the collection cart outside the laundry room, checked her assignment sheet and headed for Bay 7 to draw the blood that had been missed on overnight. The President of the United States knew her name. The Joint Special Operations Command had her on file as the person who had stopped a biological weapon from destroying a major American city in the early hours of a Thursday morning in October. in the controlled, classified language of the after-action report that Declan would file by the end of the day, she would be identified by rank clearance level and a service record that most people with her experience would have spent the rest of their lives pointing to. In room 4 of Oak Creek Memorial, someone had slept on sheets she had just changed and would wake up in a few hours without knowing who had put them there. That was fine. That was in fact exactly what she had come here for, not the invisibility of someone hiding, but the quiet of someone who had finally decided that not every part of her life needed to be in service of the same emergency. She would know what she had done with it. That had always been enough. She had just needed to remember it. She found the patient in Bay 7, introduced herself, and reached for the tourniquet. There are people like Avery in every room, quiet, overlooked, carrying more than anyone around them could imagine. The ones we dismiss the fastest are sometimes the ones holding everything together. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you're here for the next one.